how much of the scientific research do you have to use when you're designing a space, right? So for example, I think of performance and I think of so many spaces that I've been to that are super echoey, right? They're restaurants, for example, just something, let's pick something basic. You go to a restaurant, you can barely hear the person next to you because it's so loud and so echoey. Your brain is processing way more information that way. It does usually create a little bit more anxiety and stress. You don't enjoy the experience as much of being in that place. If you're in a work environment, it could be even more pronounced, right? It's lack of concentration. You're easily distracted. So I think that like the performance side of things, that's one thing that I would point to that says that's not necessarily tied to disability, but I would wager that it also helps people with cognitive impairments, people with, attention deficit disorder, like autism, right? All of those factors come in, but so it's two-part question. One is talk about like some concrete performance things that you guys do, and then how much of the scientific research do you have to dive into when you're doing those designs in order to make sure you're doing it correctly?
So I think a lot of what we do, so we developed a tool for this because we know that designers, we don't usually do the design ourselves. We'll help designers who've been hired to do a space, and we help them make it more inclusive or universal. And so we've developed a tool called the Innovative Solutions for Universal Design at thisisud.com. And this tool basically takes that research and boils it down into certain, steps. Do this, 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 and this in these areas. And you get to choose, how many you're going to do. We give credits for that, and we will certify buildings that do a certain number that, of those solutions in each space. But we basically say, here are the things that we can do that are beyond code that will make the environment better for everybody. So we've taken all of our research and we've synthesized it down into these about 500 solutions that help make it easier for people. Now, of course, these are voluntary; nobody has to do them, and so the struggle is getting people to use these solutions where they are. It's not too hard. Like you talked about acoustics in a restaurant. The reason they're not thinking about that is because they're not thinking about acoustics. They're thinking about food and food service and getting food to people and making people enjoy their time at the restaurant. And so their acoustics is at the top of their mind. Whereas if you're designing, like a concert venue, the architect might hire an acoustic consultant to tell them, here's the best way to make the place sound good, because that's what the space is for. Yep. But it doesn't mean that acoustics aren't important in a restaurant. It's not at the top of people's mind, and they're not going and spending money on an acoustic consultant. They're thinking about, well, how does the space look? They're also usually smaller, so there's fewer people in the room to make decisions. You might just have like an owner, right, who's making decisions like, oh, I like the way this looks, and I like the way that looks, and I want the ceiling painted black, and whatever it is. Whereas if you're designing like a concert venue, there's a lot of money involved, a lot of stakeholders at the table, and there's somebody there to chime in and say, we want to have the best sounding music, right? And so, yes, we should spend the money to hire the consultant. And so there's a lot of competing interests. Or there's a lot of different interests that people have when they have a building. And so, their primary focus, isn't always what other people think are important.
Of course.
We see that with lighting too, lighting in a restaurant. A lot of people, it's too dark, and people just aren't thinking about that. A lot of times when they design the restaurant, they're just thinking of the ambiance or whatever.
But isn't that a big lesson with universal design, is that there's so much more to think about in the design process. Like that can seem daunting, but the benefits are also huge if you do it right.
Yeah, that is what we try to tell people. That, it's important to think of everything. If you want to accommodate everybody, accommodate as many people as possible, give people the most enjoyable experience, you need to think about everything. Restaurants is tough because a lot of times they're small, independently owned. When you start looking at bigger companies and bigger places, they've got, whole teams of people who are looking at marketing and imaging and how we look and all of that. And even then, they can sometimes get it wrong because they want a cool aesthetic and have it all dark, and they want a young, hip audience, right? So they don't care about this other crowd sometimes. So it can be a double-edged sword having a larger group too. It all depends on what their objectives are. It's really all about priority and value. What do you value as a company, or as a person? Do we value inclusion enough to make sure that we're doing everything we can compared to all the other things that we value, like having a good ambiance and having a young, hip crowd, or whatever it is that you're trying to get to your establishment?